I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Dana Perino.
I'm Tyrus, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, June 30th, 2021. I'm Jessica Rosenthal. What is critical race theory, and why is it prompting such visceral reaction around the country, especially in schools?
It's an argument that says all black problems today are the fault of whites and the responsibility of whites to solve.
Still others feel very differently.
This is something that scholars have used to understand how race is affecting all of our systems in this country.
I'm Dave Anthony. Former President Trump goes to the border today in an area of Texas overrun in a surge of migrants that's been tough to stop.
What they're dealing with right now, because it's such a large influx, is they think they have a handle on things in one area, and then word will spread that they're in that area, and then it gets overwhelming in another area of the border.
And I'm Geraldo Rivera. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
It's prompted loud, raucous school board meetings like this one in Loudoun County, Virginia.
Resign! My child is not oppressed, and don't assume that. As long as you Marxists push your unconstitutional agenda on my child, she will not be returning back to Loudoun County School.
Recall efforts against school board members have greatly increased. Parent groups have formed, and educators are on defense asking, what are we allowed to say? As some states push for and pass new laws banning CRT from being taught in schools, critical race theory. It's gone beyond concerns about K-12 education and sparked debate with top military brass.
I do think it's important, actually, for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and be widely read. And the United States Military Academy is a university. And it is important that we train and we understand. And I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it.
General Mark Milley testified during a recent House committee hearing.
I've read Mao Zedong. I've read Karl Marx. I've read Lenin. That doesn't make me a communist. So what is wrong with understanding? Having some situational understanding about the country for which we are here to defend. And I personally find it offensive that we are accusing the United States military, our general officers, our commissioned, non-commissioned officers of being, quote, woke or something else because we're studying some theories that are out there.
For all the anger and talk about what CRT is, most school boards insist their new equity programs or attempts to support black and brown students are not curriculum changes that result in the teaching of this theory. So what is it? I'll read what the American Bar Association has put out about this in January. They first note that when he was president, Donald Trump issued an executive order that banned from federal contracts any divisive concepts about race or sex stereotyping or scapegoating. President Biden rescinded this order. The ABA explains that CRT critiques how the social construction of race and institutionalized racism perpetuates a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tiers. They add that it acknowledges the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship on black Americans and other people of color continues to permeate the social fabric of this nation.
CRT, or critical race theory, in my mind, is an academic term.
Kristal Knight is a Democratic and social impact strategist.
It's something that was developed in the 1980s by legal scholars to really understand how race is framed in the systems of this country and how we should approach, thinking about all of the systems and structures under this particular lens. So I do not, think that it is a catch-all for social justice, for racial justice, or any of those things. I look at it in the lens that this is something that scholars have used to understand how race is affecting all of our systems in this country. And when I hear people push back against it, what I'm hearing them say is, I don't want to talk about race, which is, something that they should just say, as opposed to weaponizing this ideology and making it something that is just simply not.
So you're asking people to sort of discuss, debate everything through that lens then. That lens colors everything.
When you say everything, what do you mean, right? And so I think if we're talking about, race, or if we're talking about a movement and we say, based on the critical race theory ideology or based on the critical race theory aspect, this is how one could understand how I would feel about racism being prominent in this system. So specifically, if I were to say America was founded, with the idea of white male privilege being in mind and looking at that from a critical race theory perspective, a woman like me, a Black woman, I was not written in the founding documents of this country, if I'm looking at it through that lens. And so that's just an example of how we get to understand how critical race theory is woven in, or how we can think about race in all of the contexts, or a few of the contexts that we may dialogue about or study or whatever. But again, I don't think that, this assumption or this question of are students being taught this actual ideology every single day in schools, I reject that thought, and I reject that position.
Well, I think one of the concerns is not that necessarily CRT is being taught, but that lens is being applied to history class. And while you have school boards saying, whoa, wait a second, our new equity or diversity or inclusion program is not CRT, you do have some educators talking in a way that does alarm some parents. And I want to run this by you. Earlier this year, there was a diversity summit with an Oregon school district, and I guess it was done virtually. One teacher said, if you're not evolving into an anti-racist educator, you'll become obsolete, saying that teachers may even be fired in the future for damaging and traumatizing kids by what she said is keeping up with the old views of colonialism. And another teacher said that white teachers need to be anti-racist with the same zeal as the Capitol rioters on January 6th. This is just, one discussion, right? When parents hear that kind of language, they get afraid and they get skeptical that their white children maybe are going to be told you're an oppressor and that children of color are the oppressed.
When I hear, when I read the article and actually watched the video where she was speaking, I did not personally take offense to it. I'm not a parent and I don't have any children in school actively, so I have a different perspective. Black people in this country and anyone who identifies as non-white, and I'm not speaking for an entire population of people, but one thing that I believe is true is that history books in this country have been written by white people. And when they're written by white people, they come with a white perspective. However, you also have many teachers who come from all different races and creeds. And so when you're taught in school about the Civil War, for instance, and that, the Civil War was fought because this certain group of states wanted to take back their land or fight for their freedoms, blah, 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 blah. And as a Black student sitting in a class understanding that the Civil War was fought around keeping Black people enslaved, one has to imagine, how are you say, one person will say, well, I don't want critical race theory taught in schools. But what about the Black parents who say, well, my children are not being taught the truth about the Civil War. They're not being taught the truth about racial relations in this country. And so again, to just say that I don't want to talk about race in my school district and I'm going to use critical race theory because of it, that's just a false premise. And we should just say that and be honest with our parents across this country about that.
Now, of course, ask different folks what CRT is and why it's making some people so upset, and you'll get different answers. Jason Riley is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a Wall Street Journal columnist, and a Fox News contributor.
I think it's a fancy argument for racial preferences, frankly. I think that's the simplest way to understand it. And I'm not being overly reductive here. If you go back to the 1970s, when these theories were coming out of the legal community in academia, the argument put forward by critical race theorists like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and others was that race should be used as an academic credential in the hiring process in the academy. That was their argument. That's how they wanted race used, and they put forward critical race theory as the justification for that. And that is, it's an argument that says all Black problems today are the fault of whites and the responsibility of whites to solve. That racism permeates all of our institutions and has since slavery and before, and therefore that is the lens through which we should judge all racial disparities that we see today. This is the cause of them.
Republicans are passing laws in some states to stop what they say is CRT, specifically in K through 12 education. And I'm wondering, some of these laws don't even say the words critical race theory necessarily. Like, for example, the Tennessee bill says educators can't talk about systemic racism, criticize meritocracy, or address privilege or oppression. Some educators say this is like stifling their speech, like not using the word oppression. Where are we supposed to go with some of these laws and what they're telling teachers they can say?
The way I sort of start to think about this is that, your typical eighth grader in this country, and particularly in our largest cities, your Houstons and New Yorks and Los Angeleses and Chicagos, cannot read or do math at grade level. I mean, doesn't that strike you as a bigger problem that we should be addressing before we turn them into social justice warriors? And particularly given that the kids who aren't reading and doing math at grade level are overwhelmingly Black and Hispanic kids, the very groups that these progressives claim to care the most about. And I find it striking that that is not their main focus. Instead, this centering, as they say, of race in schools is the focus. And I frankly can't think of a more short-sighted or even dangerous thing to do than to take kids in an increasingly pluralistic America. The fastest growing groups are Asians and Hispanics and so forth, and teach these children to focus on their racial and ethnic differences. I mean, I think that is insanity, frankly.
Jason, I want to ask you, because it's not just K through 12 education, right? Recently, military brass got into it with Congressman Matt Gaetz at a recent hearing. And they were talking about if the military is teaching critical race theory, and even they went so far as to accuse the military of hiring a critical race theorist to advise on personnel matters. And Defense Secretary Austin said, and I'm going to read this quote, "I don't know what the issue of critical race theory is and what the relevance here is with the department. We do not teach critical race theory. We don't embrace critical race theory. I think it's a spurious conversation." General Milley said it was offensive to suggest that members of the military would be attempting to be, quote, woke by merely reading about an academic theory. What is your thought on the tension and discussion over what the military is doing, especially because they recently have been investigating, according to Secretary Austin, extremism within the military?
I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think we should be doing it. But it tells you how far down this road we've already gone and how there is a need to push back before we go any further. This is a very divisive concept. It is playing one American against another. And that just will end badly. And so, when President Trump made an effort to stop this trend, I think he was on the right track there. And President Biden seems intent on, doing the opposite of everything that President Trump did, regardless of the merits of what the former president was doing. But in some cases, Donald Trump had it right, and I think this is one of them.
Jason Riley, Fox News contributor, Wall Street Journal columnist, and senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
This is Geraldo Rivera with your Fox News commentary coming up.
Former President Trump goes to Texas today.
There is no more dire threat today than the crisis on our southern border.
Saying at his weekend rally in Ohio,
just a few short months ago, drugs were way down, human trafficking was way down, it was all way down.
Now, after 4 months in a row of 100,000 plus migrants being apprehended, he blames President Biden undoing some Trump border policies, which the new administration says were inhumane. Vice President Harris went to Texas last Friday.
Welcome to El Paso. Welcome to my community, to the new Ellis Island, to the capital of the border.
Democratic Congresswoman Veronica Escobar greeted Harris, who Republicans demanded for months go to the border, then were critical. She avoided areas where the migrant surge is most intense, but the vice president counters.
It is here in El Paso that the previous administration's child separation policy was unveiled.
And El Paso, where
the return to Mexico policy from the previous administration was implemented.
And Harris insists we must address the root causes of why they come.
We're talking about stories that involve horrendous tales of abuse and fear and harm.
Now, former President Trump will be joined by Republican Governor Greg Abbott in Weslaco near McAllen.
These are the areas that Republicans especially have said, and the numbers prove it, these are the high traffic areas.
We caught up with Fox Business Network's Grady Trimble in La Jolla, Texas, outside McAllen.
When the vice president visited last week, they felt like she didn't go to the right areas because she didn't go to the Rio Grande Valley where migrants are moving through here. So they've been critical of that, and I don't think it's an accident that they're coming to this area. They're doing it intentionally because this is where so many of the problems are right now.
So you're down there. What have you seen so far?
We were reporting live along the border wall, and it's interesting to see in this area because this is one of the areas where construction was halted by the Biden administration. So you can see areas where the wall's constructed, and then you can see areas where obviously there were plans for wall, and it's not there at all. And then after that, we headed over, that was near Mission, Texas. We headed over to La Jolla, which is about 20 minutes down the road. And this is one of the areas where we are now, where a lot of migrants and families have been moving through. And that's exactly what we saw this morning, about 24 or so, maybe more, including women, children, and they were essentially corralled by Border Patrol, loaded into buses, and presumably from there they go to the processing facilities elsewhere.
All right. Now, describe the terrain, because nobody can see anything where you are right now. What's it like at the exact border spot where they're coming across?
So we are, I would say, a half a mile to a mile from the actual border. This is an area where if we went through to the actual border and to the Rio Grande River, we would have to go through very dense brush. We would have to go over private property, and eventually we would make it to where the actual border is. So by the time they get to this area, they've gone through all of that, and that's when they encounter Border Patrol, potentially for the first time on the ground. But there are, of course, Coast Guard and other agencies, Border Patrol on the river, going up and down the river, and they're also circling in helicopters and trying to survey by air to see these groups of migrants move through this area, and then the ground crews meet them where we are right now.
Do most try to cross the river at night?
I was talking with the Texas Department of Public Safety today, and they're essentially down here to assist Border Patrol because Border Patrol is so overwhelmed with processing, so they need help on the border itself. And I asked that question as well, and they said it depends on the weather, it depends on the types of groups, whether it's, people with young kids, whether it's people who appear to be members of cartels or smugglers. So you will see people traveling in the early morning hours just before the sun comes up. But when we saw that group of a couple dozen people, it was broad daylight. It was probably 9 in the morning.
Did any of them run? Were they just walking together and then they were just apprehended? What happened?
So my understanding is actually that some of them want to be apprehended because then they're in the United States and sent to a processing facility in the United States. And, it's as crazy as it sounds, a bit of respite after such a treacherous journey. That's the families and the people who are, coming here from Central America. On the flip side, you have people who are from Mexico. In fact, Griff Jenkins, who's also down here with us, captured video of about 5 men who identified themselves to him as people who were from Mexico. They weren't with one of these groups of women and children and families, and they did try to run from Border Patrol. So you have both going on at the same time, and, Border Patrol and the other agencies that are down here are constantly dealing with both of those things.
Those who are apprehended, do they all stay? Do some get sent back?
I think some get sent back, but honestly, when we're talking to the people on the ground near the border, they don't really know what happens once they're loaded up into the buses and taken to the processing facilities. So they're not as familiar with that side of things. What they are very familiar with is them actually being apprehended. And, looking at the numbers, it is staggering. Just in the Rio Grande Valley where we are, 2,100 apprehensions in the last 24 hours. That doesn't even include the other stretches of the southern border elsewhere in Texas and elsewhere in the country. So those numbers are staggering, and that's what they're dealing with on the ground here, not necessarily the processing side, which is, in a totally different area.
Something else I know that you are looking into while you're at the border, while you're reporting on all this, is the drug smuggling. And that's a big part of the story at the border as well.
It is. And you can't even separate the two parts of this, which is people coming across the border and drugs coming across the border. Because when we talk to people on the ground here in law enforcement, they tell us, we're seeing tens of thousands of pounds of drugs come through in a month's time. And oftentimes the cartels are the ones leading the migrants through here, and they're getting paid to do that by the migrants who are, seeking a better life here. But the law enforcement that we've talked to say that's a problem because they're literally receiving millions of dollars to do this, and it's making the cartels more and more powerful and more dangerous. In fact, one of the things we're following is Operation Lone Star, and that is essentially commissioned by the governor in Texas, Greg Abbott, who said, Border Patrol's so overwhelmed, we're going to send some of our people with the Department of Public Safety to get involved as well. And they found over $1 million in cash, 140 firearms, again, thousands of pounds of illegal drugs in just the few months that operation has been going on.
Right, and we're talking about a variety of drugs coming across, right?
Oh, yeah, there's marijuana, there's cocaine and methamphetamine. Those are the two largest categories of types of drugs brought across. But there's also fentanyl, too, and as, a lot of people across the country will know, that's extremely dangerous. And one of the reasons the, opioid epidemic has taken its toll on people in this country.
When you talk to a border agent, I know you did a short time before we had our conversation, do you feel like they're overwhelmed, or do they feel like they have a handle on it? What do they say?
I think they feel overwhelmed, or else they wouldn't be asking for help from other state agencies, whether it's the Public Safety Department here in Texas or agencies as far away as Nebraska and Florida being sent in to help. I think that any amount of help they can receive, they would be grateful for. And frankly, they told me outright on air and behind the scenes that they don't think that the federal government is doing enough. And by that, they mean the Biden administration. They'll tell you that, the construction of the border wall is helpful from their experiences because it allows them to sort of push people into a certain direction of the border and then focus their resources on those areas. But right now, as I mentioned, you see these huge gaps in the wall, and there are areas where it's not constructed at all, and that makes their jobs extremely challenging. And one of the agents I was just talking to said what they're dealing with right now, because it's such a large influx, is they think they have a handle on things in one area, and then, word will spread that they're in that area, and then it gets overwhelming in another area of the border.
Obviously, Governor Abbott is wanting to restart all that construction, and he's soliciting people to donate and all of that. How much of the construction that was stopped can he do, and is he facing legal challenges to that?
I'm sure he will. I don't know of any specifically, but the problem that even the federal government deals with in terms of border wall construction is that a lot of the border is on private property, so they have to get permission from the property owners to build there. I do know that from the cooperative property owners who want Governor Abbott and the state of Texas to continue erecting the wall, they've put up temporary fences essentially in certain areas to try to send the message, that we're here, we're going to stop you if you try to get through. But as the Trump administration learned as well, it is a challenge to construct the border wall, but Abbott seems keen on doing it. He's put aside $250 million in state funding to do it. And as you said, I think in the first week of that crowdfunding effort, the state raised something like $450,000. And since we're talking about costs, the Operation Lone Star that they have going on right now is costing $2.5 million per week, and that's primarily in overtime for the crews that they have down here. That's housing them in this area, bringing them in from elsewhere, and putting them up in hotels. So that's an expensive operation as well.
The landowners, and you referenced that you need some permission for this border wall on private property, but there have been a lot of landowners who have had enough. I mean, they've had their property overrun by people coming across the border.
Right. Yeah. And we, talk with people on Fox Business and Fox News all the time who are landowners, ranchers, business owners who deal with it all the time, and they see these large groups coming through their property. One of the challenges may be they might own the property close to the border, but that doesn't mean they own the property right on the border. Or even if they do, that maybe there's just not as much activity in terms of construction because they're focusing their efforts on other areas at the moment. But certainly there are a lot of people in this stretch of the border who have had enough of it, especially lately, because if you look at the numbers, it's a huge increase from, a year ago.
Grady Trimble, Fox Business Network correspondent at the border in La Jolla, Texas. Great to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us, Grady.
Thank you, Dave.
Jason in the House, the Jason Chaffetz podcast. Dive deeper than the headlines and the party lines as I take on American life, politics, and entertainment. Subscribe now on foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts.
Subscribe to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Geraldo Rivera.
What's on your mind?
I grew up in and around New York's Times Square. They used to say that if you stand on the corner of 42nd Street and Broadway long enough, eventually you'll see everybody you ever knew, because everybody visits Times Square. My Fox office now is a block away. It is the crossroads of the world, the beating heart of the Great White Way. But it is also the scene recently of a toddler getting caught in a crossfire of a wild shootout between rival gangs. And earlier this week, a U.S. Marine, 21-year-old Samuel Poulin, being shot in the back in another wild shootout in Times Square, this time involving rival illegal street vendors. This high-profile violence has finally awakened New York's sleepy Mayor de Blasio, who says he is surging 50 additional cops to patrol the legendary neighborhood. This from the mayor who allowed his police force to be defunded, $1 billion, and an entire police academy class to be canceled. Tom Harris, who's the head of the Times Square Alliance of Business People and Community Leaders, says these latest high-profile incidents of violence are the result of policies that do not focus on the enforcement of lower-level offenses, like the rival gangs of street vendors, and embolden, these policies do, would-be criminals to carry weapons. Eric Adams, the former police captain who leads in the race for New York City mayor, said, quote, "The news of another shooting in Times Square in broad daylight is a chilling reminder of the rising threat of gun violence across our city. And folks, it's not just New York. It's where you live. From Friday afternoon through early Monday morning, at least 77 people were shot in Chicago. 77 people shot, 7 fatally. Where I live now in Cleveland, Ohio, in the week since the start of the summer, June 21st, my mid-sized Midwestern city has suffered 37 people shot, 3 stabbed, 4 killed. If this carnage was not mostly black on black, perhaps the country would care more, because activists only seem to care if a cop is involved. We are witnessing a national ghetto civil war, fueled by drugs and gangs and guns. This is the civil rights issue of our time. I'm Geraldo Rivera reporting. Fox News.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. Fox News Radio on demand on the Fox News app. Download the app and just click listen. When you swipe left, you can listen to your favorite Fox News talk shows live. Swipe right for the latest Fox News Radio newscasts on demand. Fox News Radio on the Fox News app. Download it today.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.